It was an ordinary day when I noticed something unusual. A group of individuals in official-looking uniforms walking onto my property. At first, I thought they might be utility workers or government officials. But as I approached, it became clear. They were representatives from the HOA, calling themselves the HOA Patrol. Without a prior warning, they began inspecting areas of my yard, taking notes, and even pointing out things they deemed violations. It was baffling. I had never given anyone permission to enter my property, let alone patrol it like a private investigator. The frustration grew as I tried to question their purpose. They claimed to be ensuring the community's standards were upheld, but what standards could possibly involve trespassing onto someone's private property? As I stood there, conflicted between anger and disbelief, one thing became clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a blatant overreach of authority. From that moment, I knew this wasn't something I could ignore. My rights were being trampled, and if this could happen to me, it could happen to anyone. The so-called HOA Patrol is a group established by the Homeowners Association to enforce community guidelines. On paper, it sounds harmless, ensuring properties are well-maintained and rules are followed. But what happens when this group starts crossing boundaries? The patrol seemed to operate under a sense of unchecked authority. They claimed they were acting in the community's best interest, but their actions spoke otherwise. They weren't just observing. They were actively invading private spaces, nitpicking at trivial matters. What's even more unsettling is the lack of clarity regarding their powers. Do they have legal standing? Are they trained professionals, or just neighbors wielding a badge of authority? These questions kept circling in my mind as I tried to understand their motives. Many residents assume the HOA's power is limited to communal areas, but the patrol's behavior suggested otherwise. Was this a new directive or an isolated misuse of authority? Regardless, their actions created a clear divide between the HOA and the very people it's supposed to serve. Private property is sacred in the United States. It's a fundamental right protected by law, ensuring individuals have autonomy over their space. However, when the HOA Patrol stepped onto my property uninvited, they crossed a legal and ethical line. HOAs have specific powers, often outlined in governing documents like covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and RS. These typically grant them authority over shared spaces and compliance enforcement, but only up to the property line. When it comes to private property, their reach stops at the boundary. Their claim of ensuring community standards doesn't grant them the right to trespass. According to legal experts, entering someone's property without permission can be considered trespassing, which is a punishable offense in many states. This realization strengthened my resolve to stand up for my rights. I began documenting everything: photos of their presence, records of their actions, and even interactions with the patrol. The more I researched, the clearer it became. The HOA had overstepped, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. The first confrontation with the HOA Patrol was nothing short of tense. As they wandered through my yard, clipboard in hand, I approached them to demand an explanation. "What are you doing here?" I asked firmly. Their response was vague and condescending. "We're here to ensure compliance with HOA regulations," one of them said, avoiding eye contact. That only raised more questions. Compliance with what? And why did they think they could enter without permission? When I pointed out that they were trespassing, they shrugged it off, claiming that their role allowed them to investigate any property within the neighborhood. That's when I snapped. "This is private property. It's none of your business, so get out." The patrol members seemed taken aback, but stood their ground. It became a back-and-forth argument, with me reiterating my rights and them clinging to their supposed authority. Eventually, they left, but not without warning that non-compliance could result in fines. It was a surreal experience, a blatant intrusion thinly veiled as community management. This wasn't about rules, it was about control. After the confrontation, I was left wondering, why had the HOA sent their patrol to my property in the first place? I had no outstanding complaints, no violations that I was aware of. So what was the trigger? Digging into the HOA's recent activities, I discovered that they had launched a new initiative to crack down on perceived violations. This included everything from landscaping choices to the placement of outdoor furniture. But my property didn't fall under any of these categories. at least not according to the community guidelines I had reviewed. A neighbor hinted that a complaint might have been filed anonymously. This raised another concern. Was the HOA using these complaints as an excuse to overreach? Or was there a more personal vendetta at play? The motives behind their actions remained murky, but one thing was clear. Their approach was excessive and invasive. If they thought they could intimidate me into compliance, they were in for a surprise. When I share my experience with neighbors, the responses were mixed. Some were shocked, expressing outrage at the HOA's behavior. Others seemed indifferent, dismissing it as just another HOA thing. Interestingly, a few neighbors admitted they had experienced similar incidents but had chosen not to speak up. "It's not worth the trouble," one person told me. This attitude of silence only emboldens organizations like the HOA to continue overstepping their boundaries. However, a handful of neighbors rallied behind me. They believed this was a community-wide issue and that if the HOA wasn't held accountable, things would only get worse. Together, we began to organize a group of homeowners united against what we saw as HOA overreach. This solidarity was empowering. It was a reminder that as individuals we might feel powerless, but as a collective we had a voice strong enough to challenge even the most overbearing authority. Determined to stand my ground, I consulted a real estate attorney to better understand my rights. The attorney was quick to affirm that what the HOA Patrol had done was likely illegal. Trespassing laws were clear, and the HOA's authority didn't extend beyond shared spaces or explicit property lines. The attorney recommended a multi-step approach: document everything, file a formal complaint with the HOA board, and, if necessary, take legal action. Armed with this advice, I felt a renewed sense of confidence. I drafted a detailed account of the incident, including photos and timestamps, and sent it to the HOA board. The letter demanded an immediate explanation and outlined my willingness to escalate the matter legally if the patrol's actions weren't addressed. This wasn't just about protecting my property. It was about sending a message. If the HOA could get away with this, they would continue to push boundaries, eroding the rights of everyone in the community. As the days passed, the fallout from the HOA Patrol's actions became more evident. Their behavior wasn't just an annoyance. It was an abuse of power that had serious implications. First, their actions created a climate of fear within the neighborhood. Several residents admitted they felt scrutinized and worried about the HOA showing up unannounced on their property. This wasn't the sense of community the HOA was supposed to foster. Second, it exposed the HOA to potential legal risks. If homeowners began to sue for trespassing or harassment, the legal fees could quickly add up, affecting the entire community's budget. Was this level of micromanagement worth the cost? Lastly, it eroded trust. The HOA is meant to serve the homeowners, but their overreach alienated the very people they were supposed to represent. Instead of being a collaborative body, the HOA came across as a self-serving entity focused on control. This situation was no longer just about my property. It was about holding the HOA accountable to prevent further abuses of power. What started as a personal dispute soon became a rallying cry for change. Frustrated by the HOA's heavy-handed tactics, several neighbors joined forces to demand accountability. We organized meetings, inviting homeowners to share their experiences. The stories were shocking. Patrols targeting properties over trivial issues, unexplained fines, and even threats of foreclosure for minor infractions. This wasn't about enforcing rules. It was about intimidation. The growing discontent led to the creation of a petition demanding the dissolution of the HOA Patrol. Within weeks, we had gathered enough signatures to force the board to address our concerns. At the next HOA meeting, the room was packed with homeowners demanding answers. The pressure worked. The board agreed to suspend the patrol program, pending a full review. For the first time, it felt like the community had reclaimed its voice. After weeks of tension, the situation reached a resolution. The HOA formally apologized for the patrol's actions and promised to respect the boundaries of private property moving forward. While it wasn't a perfect outcome, it was a significant step in the right direction. For me, this experience was a lesson in standing up for what's right. By asserting my rights and seeking support from the community, I was able to push back against an overbearing HOA. It also showed the importance of knowing your rights and not being afraid to challenge authority when it crosses the line. The victory wasn't just mine, it was a win for the entire neighborhood. It sent a clear message. Homeowners have rights and no one, not even an HOA, has the power to violate them. From that point on, I vowed to remain vigilant. This experience had proven that complacency only enables abuse, but standing together as a community can bring real change.